Marcus Johnson sat in his usual spot at the back of Ms. Patterson's seventh grade classroom, but today was different. His eyes kept moving to the clock on the wall, watching each minute pass slowly. His mother hadn't come home last night, and the worry in his stomach felt like heavy stones. The morning had started strangely. Their neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, an old lady who always gave him cookies after school, had come to their apartment instead of his mother waking him up. Her eyes were red, and her voice shook when she told him to get ready for school. When he asked about his mom, Mrs. Thompson just patted his shoulder and said everything would be explained later. The classroom door opened suddenly. Principal Roberts walked in with two people Marcus had never seen before, a tall woman in a gray suit and a police officer. Miss Patterson stopped writing on the whiteboard and looked at them with surprise. "We need to speak with Marcus Johnson," Principal Roberts said quietly. The whole class turned to look at Marcus. He felt his hands start to sweat. Something was very wrong. His mother always said that when police officers came to school, it meant bad news. Marcus stood up slowly, his chair making a loud scraping sound against the floor. As he walked to the front of the classroom, he could hear some of his classmates whispering. His best friend Tommy gave him a worried look. Principal Roberts led them to his office. The room felt too small with all of them inside. Marcus sat in a big chair that made him feel smaller than his 12 years. The woman in the gray suit introduced herself as Ms. Carter from Social Services, but Marcus barely heard her. He was looking at the police officer's face, trying to read what was coming. "Marcus," Ms. Carter said gently, "I'm very sorry to tell you this, but your mother passed away last night." The words hit him like a punch to his chest. He couldn't breathe properly. The room started spinning a little. "That's not true," Marcus said, his voice coming out strange and tight. "She was fine yesterday morning. She made me breakfast. She put extra syrup on my pancakes." The police officer, Officer Williams according to his name tag, leaned forward. "Son, your mother had a heart problem she didn't know about. She collapsed at work last night. The doctors at the hospital tried their best, but they couldn't save her." Marcus felt tears coming, but he held them back. His mother always said Johnson men were strong, but she also said it was okay to cry when your heart was hurting. Right now, his heart felt like it was breaking into a million pieces. Miss Carter started talking about arrangements and his aunt in Detroit, but Marcus couldn't focus on her words. All he could think about was yesterday morning, his mom's bright smile, the way she kissed his forehead before leaving for work, how she promised to help him with his science project when she got home. "Can I see her?" Marcus asked suddenly, interrupting Miss Carter. The adults exchanged looks. Officer Williams shook his head slowly. "Not right now, son. She's at the city morgue. There are procedures we need to follow." Marcus didn't understand why there had to be procedures just to see his mom. She was his mom. He should be able to see her whenever he wanted. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Mrs. Thompson came to pick him up early from school. She took him home and tried to make him eat something, but food tasted like nothing in his mouth. He sat on their old couch, looking at his mother's favorite coffee mug still sitting on the kitchen counter. As the sun started to set, casting long shadows in their small apartment, Marcus heard Mrs. Thompson talking quietly on the phone about funeral arrangements. The word made everything feel more real, more final. His Aunt Janet would arrive from Detroit in 3 days to take him back with her. Marcus went to his mother's room and sat on her bed. It still smelled like her favorite lavender lotion. On her dresser, family pictures smiled at him, his mother holding him as a baby, at his 5th grade graduation, at the park last summer. In all of them, she looked so alive, so strong. How could she be gone? It didn't make sense. As night fell, Marcus lay on his mother's bed, holding her pillow close. Only then, in the darkness of the room where he'd spent so many nights being comforted by her after bad dreams, did he finally let his tears fall. The next morning, Marcus woke up still holding his mother's pillow. For a few seconds, he thought everything had been a bad dream, but the quiet in the apartment was too heavy, too real. Mrs. Thompson's soft humming came from the kitchen instead of his mother's usual morning singing. Marcus didn't want to go to school, and no one made him. He spent the morning sitting in his mother's room, looking at her things. Each object held memories. Her work shoes by the door, her reading glasses on the nightstand, her favorite sweater hanging on the closet door. His Aunt Janet would arrive in 2 days, and he knew they would have to pack everything up. While looking through his mother's dresser drawers for photos to keep, Marcus found something strange. Hidden under folded sweaters was a small wooden box he had never seen before. It had beautiful carvings on it that looked like the African art his mother sometimes bought from the cultural festival downtown. His hand shook a little as he opened it. Inside, he found an old leather journal and a small glass vial filled with dark liquid. The journal's pages were worn, like it had been read many times. Marcus recognized his mother's neat handwriting, but there were also other styles of writing, much older. The ink faded with time. Marcus began to read. Asterisk, my dearest son, if you are reading this, something has happened to me. This journal has been passed down through generations of our family, from mother to child, all the way back to our ancestors in West Africa. Inside these pages is the knowledge of an ancient healing ritual, one that has been kept secret and sacred. Asterisk. His heart beating faster, Marcus kept reading. The journal told an incredible story. His ancestors had been healers who knew how to make a special liquid that could bring people back from death, but only if it was used within 3 days, and only if the person's spirit was still connected to their body. The small vial in the box contained this liquid. His mother had written about receiving it from his grandmother, who got it from her mother before her. Each generation added their own notes to the journal, writing about the ritual and its power. Marcus's hands trembled as he held the vial up to the light. The liquid inside seemed to shimmer slightly, like dark honey with tiny stars caught in it. According to the journal, it needed to be given to the person while speaking special words in an ancient language. His mother had written these words carefully on one page, with notes on how to pronounce them correctly. He sat on the floor for a long time, reading and rereading the journal. Part of him thought it couldn't be real. People couldn't come back from death. But another part remembered all the stories his mother used to tell them about their family's special healing gifts, about the magic that ran in their blood. From the kitchen, Marcus heard Mrs. Thompson talking on the phone about the funeral. It would be in 4 days. His mother's body was at the city morgue, waiting. 3 days, that's what the journal said. After 3 days, the ritual wouldn't work. Marcus looked at the clock on his mother's nightstand. It had been almost 24 hours since they told him she died. That meant he had 2 days left. 2 days to try the ritual, to bring his mother back. He knew what adults would say. They would tell him it was just a story, that he was letting his grief make him believe impossible things. But his mother had believed. She had kept this journal safe, had added her own notes to it. She wouldn't have done that if it was just a story. Marcus carefully put the vial in his pocket and hid the journal under his mattress. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the city morgue building a few blocks away. You could see its gray walls rising above the other buildings. 2 days. He had 2 days to find a way inside that building. 2 days to try saving his mother. As he watched the morgue building, Marcus made his decision. He didn't care if it was impossible. He didn't care if he got in trouble. He had to try. His mother had always taught him that family never gave up on each other. Now it was his turn to prove he believed that too. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. The vial felt warm in his pajama pocket, like it was alive somehow. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother smile, heard her laugh. He kept thinking about all the times she had helped him when he was scared or sick. Now it was his turn to help her. Mrs. Thompson had finally gone home for the night, making him promise to call if he needed anything. Marcus waited an extra hour to make sure she wouldn't come back to check on him. Then he got out of bed and pulled his mother's journal from under his mattress. Sitting at the kitchen table with just one small lamp on, Marcus studied the building plans he had drawn earlier. The city morgue was only 4 blocks away. He had walked past it many times on his way to school, but he had never paid much attention to it before. Now he noticed everything about it. That afternoon, while Mrs. Thompson was busy talking to the funeral home people, Marcus had walked to the morgue. He spent 2 hours watching the building, pretending to do homework on a nearby bench. He counted how many people went in and out. He noticed which doors they used. He saw where the security cameras were. The journal in front of him had more than just the ritual words. It had warnings, too. If he did this wrong, if he spoke the words incorrectly or used the liquid after 3 days had passed, it wouldn't work. Worse, according to his great-grandmother's notes, it might make it impossible for his mother's spirit to rest. Marcus felt the weight of this responsibility heavy on his shoulders. He was only 12, but he had to make this big decision by himself. What if he failed? What if he got caught? What if the ritual didn't work, and he wasted the sacred liquid his family had kept safe for generations? But then he thought about the alternative. His Aunt Janet would arrive tomorrow evening. The funeral was in 3 days. After that, his mother would be buried, and he would have to leave Chicago, leave everything he knew. If there was even a small chance the ritual could work, didn't he have to try? Marcus opened the journal to the page with the ritual words. He practiced saying them quietly, over and over, until his tongue stopped stumbling over the strange sounds. His mother's handwriting showed how to pronounce each word, with little notes about which sounds were important to get right. While he practiced, Marcus made his plan. The morgue had a back door that the cleaning staff used late at night. He had watched a cleaner prop it open with a brick while she took trash out. If he timed it right, he might be able to slip inside when she wasn't looking. But first, he needed to know exactly where his mother was inside the building. Marcus remembered the funeral director's phone number from Mrs. Thompson's papers. Tomorrow morning, he would call and pretend to be from his Aunt Janet's office, asking about the arrangements. Maybe they would tell him which room his mother was in. As he sat there planning, doubt crept into Marcus's mind. What would his mother say if she knew what he was thinking about doing? She had always taught him to be honest, to follow the rules. Breaking into a building was wrong. It was probably illegal too. But then he remembered something else she always said. Sometimes, baby, love makes you brave enough to do impossible things. She had told him that story many times, about how his grandmother had walked 10 miles through a snowstorm to get medicine when he was a baby with a high fever. About how his great-grandfather had crossed dangerous waters in a tiny boat to save his brother. Marcus touched the vial in his pocket. The liquid inside seemed to pulse gently, like a tiny heartbeat. He made his decision. Tomorrow night, after Mrs. Thompson left and his Aunt Janet hadn't arrived yet, he would try to get into the morgue. He would find his mother. He would speak the ritual words and use the sacred liquid. If love could make people brave enough to do impossible things, then maybe it could also make impossible things come true. The next morning, Marcus woke up early. His Aunt Janet would arrive that evening, which meant this was his only chance. The vial felt heavier in his pocket than it had yesterday, like it knew what was coming. After Mrs. Thompson brought him breakfast, Marcus put his plan into action. He waited until she was busy cleaning dishes, then picked up the house phone and went to his room. His hand shook a little as he dialed the funeral home's number. "Good morning, Peterson Funeral Home," a woman's voice answered. Marcus made his voice sound older, like the men he heard on business calls. "Hello, I'm calling from Janet Williams' office about Gloria Johnson's arrangements." He held his breath, hoping he sounded convincing. "Oh yes, Mrs. Johnson," the woman said. "Let me pull up her information." Marcus listened carefully as the woman talked about funeral details. Then she said exactly what he needed to hear. "She's currently in room 104 at the city morgue, lower level. We'll be moving her to our facility tomorrow morning for preparation." After hanging up, Marcus wrote down everything he remembered. Room 104, lower level. He had to get there tonight, before they moved her. The time pressure made his stomach hurt, but it also made him more determined. At lunchtime, Marcus told Mrs. Thompson he wanted to take a walk to clear his head. She looked worried but agreed, making him promise to stay close to home. Instead, Marcus walked straight to the morgue building. He sat on the same bench as yesterday, but this time he had a notebook. He wrote down everything he saw. The cleaning lady came at 2:30 p.m. to empty outside trash cans. The security guard changed shifts at 3:00 p.m. Every hour, someone in a white coat would come out for a smoke break. Marcus stayed there all afternoon, watching and writing. He noticed that the security cameras near the back door didn't move. They just pointed in one direction. He saw how the cleaning lady always propped the door open with a brick while she worked, usually for about 15 minutes at a time. Most importantly, he noticed that at 7:00 p.m., things got quieter. Fewer people came in and out. The afternoon security guard looked tired and spent more time sitting at his desk inside, visible through the front window. As the sun started to set, Marcus walked around the whole building. He found an alley behind the morgue where he could hide and watch the back door without being seen. There was a dumpster there that would make a perfect hiding spot. Walking home, Marcus went over his plan again and again in his head. He would tell Mrs. Thompson he was tired and wanted to go to bed early. Once she left, he would sneak out. His Aunt Janet's flight wasn't arriving until 9:00 p.m., so he had time. Back at the apartment, Marcus packed his backpack carefully. He put in his mother's journal, a small flashlight, and a black hoodie to help him hide in the shadows. The vial stayed in his pocket where he could feel it, safe and warm. Mrs. Thompson made him dinner, but he could barely eat. His mind kept going over everything that could go wrong. What if he got caught? What if he couldn't find room 104? What if the ritual didn't work? But every time doubt crept in, Marcus touched the vial in his pocket and remembered his mother's strength. She had raised him all by herself, working 2 jobs, sometimes to give him everything he needed. She never gave up, no matter how hard things got. At 6:30 p.m., Marcus told Mrs. Thompson he had a headache and wanted to sleep. She looked at him with sad, understanding eyes and hugged him tight. "Your aunt will be here soon," she said. "Things will get better." Marcus hugged her back, feeling guilty for what he was about to do. But as he watched Mrs. Thompson leave for the night, he knew he couldn't give up. His mother had always been there for him. Now he had to be there for her. In his room, Marcus sat on his bed and waited for full darkness to come. The vial pulsed gently in his pocket, like it was counting down the minutes with him. Soon, it would be time. At exactly 8:00 p.m., Marcus slipped out of his apartment building. The night was cool, and the streets were quieter than usual. He pulled his black hoodie tight around his face and stayed in the shadows, just like he had planned. His heart was beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. The backpack felt heavy on his shoulders, even though it didn't contain much. The vial in his pocket seemed to grow warmer with each step he took toward the morgue. When he reached the alley behind the building, Marcus crouched behind the dumpster. The smell was bad, but he didn't move. He had to wait for the right moment. According to his notes, the cleaning lady always came out at 8:15 p.m. to empty the last trash cans. The minutes felt like hours. Marcus practiced the ritual words in his head while he waited, his mother's careful pronunciation notes running through his mind. He couldn't make any mistakes when the time came. At 8:14 p.m., the back door opened. The cleaning lady came out, just like clockwork. She propped the door open with the brick, then walked to the dumpster with her trash cart. Marcus made himself as small as possible behind it. While she emptied bags into the dumpster, Marcus looked at the open door. 15 feet. That's all he had to cover. 15 feet between him and getting inside. His legs shook as he waited for his chance. The cleaning lady turned away to grab more bags from her cart. Marcus took a deep breath and moved. He ran as quietly as he could, his sneakers making almost no sound on the pavement. In seconds, he was through the door. Inside, the hallway was dim and cold. Marcus pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding. The cleaning lady's shadow moved past the doorway, but she didn't look in. After what felt like forever, he heard her cart rolling away down another corridor. Marcus pulled out his small flashlight and his mother's journal. According to what the funeral home lady had said, room 104 was on the lower level. He looked around and saw a sign pointing to stairs. The stairwell was dark and scary. Each step down made a tiny echo that sounded too loud in Marcus's ears. The vial felt like it was getting warmer and warmer in his pocket, almost like it knew it was getting closer to where it needed to be. At the bottom of the stairs, Marcus found himself in another hallway. The air was colder here, and there was a strange smell he didn't recognize. His flashlight beam showed him room numbers: 101, 102, 103. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from around the corner. Marcus quickly turned off his flashlight and pressed himself into a doorway. 2 people in white coats walked past, talking about their dinner plans. They didn't look his way, but Marcus held his breath until they were gone. Finally, he reached room 104. The door was heavy and made of metal. Marcus's hand shook as he turned the handle, expecting it to be locked. But it opened smoothly, without a sound. The room was darker than the hallway and much colder. Marcus's flashlight beam showed him rows of large metal drawers in the walls. Each drawer had a paper tag on it. He had to read each one, looking for his mother's name. Near the bottom row, he found it. Johnson, Gloria, age 42. Marcus's hands trembled as he looked at the handle on the drawer. This was really happening. His mother was in there. In just a few minutes, he would try to bring her back. A noise in the hallway made him jump. Keys jingling, footsteps coming closer. Marcus quickly turned off his flashlight and looked around frantically for a place to hide. He saw a small space between 2 filing cabinets and squeezed into it. The footsteps got closer and closer to room 104. Marcus pressed himself further into his hiding spot. The vial pulsed warmly against his chest, but his whole body felt cold with fear. He had come so far, he couldn't get caught now. Not when he was so close to saving his mother. The footsteps stopped right outside room 104. Marcus held his breath, squeezed between the filing cabinets. His heart was beating so hard he was sure whoever was out there must be able to hear it. A shadow passed under the door, then moved away. The footsteps continued down the hall, getting fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. Marcus let out his breath slowly, his legs shaking as he stepped out from his hiding place. He turned his flashlight back on with trembling hands. The beam shook as he pointed it at his mother's drawer again. The handle looked cold and heavy. Marcus wiped his sweaty palms on his hoodie and grabbed it with both hands. The drawer made a soft scraping sound as he pulled it out. Cold air rushed over his face. Marcus had to stand on his tiptoes to see inside, and what he saw made his heart stop for a moment. His mother lay there, so still and quiet. She was wearing a plain white hospital gown, and her hands were folded over her stomach. Her face looked peaceful, like she was sleeping, but Marcus had seen her sleeping hundreds of times before. This was different. "Mama," he whispered, his voice breaking. He reached out and touched her hand. It was so cold it made him pull back at first, but then he made himself touch her again. She was his mother. He couldn't be afraid to touch her. Marcus pulled out his mother's journal with shaking hands and opened it to the page with the ritual words. The vial in his pocket felt like it was burning now, almost too hot to touch. He took it out and looked at it in the flashlight beam. The dark liquid inside seemed to move on its own, swirling like tiny stars in a midnight sky. According to the journal, he had to speak the words 3 times while pouring the liquid slowly into his mother's mouth. His great-grandmother's notes said the words were a prayer to guide a spirit back to its body, to rebuild the bridge between life and death. Marcus unscrewed the vial's cap. A sweet, strange smell filled the cold air, like flowers and honey, and something else he couldn't name. He moved closer to his mother's face and very gently, just like the journal said, opened her mouth slightly. His voice shook as he started to speak the ritual words. They felt strange on his tongue, but he remembered how his mother's handwriting had shown him exactly how to say each one. As he spoke, he tilted the vial and let 3 drops fall into his mother's mouth. The liquid seemed to glow faintly as it fell, but maybe that was just his flashlight playing tricks. Marcus spoke the words a second time, letting 3 more drops fall. His voice got stronger as he remembered all the times his mother had been strong for him. On the 3rd time, he spoke the words as clearly and carefully as he could, putting all his love and hope into each sound. The last 3 drops fell from the vial, and for a moment, just a moment, Marcus thought he saw his mother's fingers twitch. He held his breath, watching her face. The journal had said it might take a few minutes for the ritual to work. Marcus held his mother's cold hand and waited, his heart pounding with hope. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes, 3. His mother didn't move. Her hand stayed cold in his. The room seemed to get even colder, like all the warmth was being sucked out of it. "Please," Marcus whispered, tears starting to roll down his face. "Please, Mama. Please wake up. I need you. Please come back." But his mother lay still and quiet. The vial was empty now, no longer warm. The journal's pages suddenly felt like just paper, the words just ink, nothing magical about them at all. Marcus stood there in the cold room, holding his mother's hand, as the truth he had been fighting against finally caught up with him. Sometimes love wasn't enough to do impossible things. Sometimes things really were impossible, no matter how much you wished they weren't. And that's when Marcus heard the door open behind him. Marcus froze when he heard the door open. He didn't turn around. He couldn't let go of his mother's hand. Tears were still running down his face, and he didn't try to hide them. "Son," a deep, gentle voice said from behind him. "Turn around slowly." Marcus did as he was told. Through his tears, he saw a tall black man in a security guard uniform. The guard's flashlight beam was pointed at the floor, not in Marcus's face. His name tag said Wilson. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. I had to try." The guard's face softened as he looked at Marcus, then at Gloria Johnson's body, then at the empty vial and journal on the metal drawer. Something in his eyes changed, like he was remembering something from long ago. "My mama had a journal like that," Guard Wilson said quietly, surprising Marcus. "When I was about your age, She got real sick. My grandmother brought out this old book, talked about ancient healing ways. Marcus stared at him, hardly daring to breathe. The guard stepped into the room and slowly closed the door behind him. Did it? Marcus started to ask, then stopped. No, Guard Wilson said gently. It didn't work for me either, but I understand why you had to try. Fresh tears fell from Marcus's eyes. The guard pulled up 2 chairs from the corner of the room and sat down in one of them, gesturing for Marcus to take the other. Tell me about your mama, Guard Wilson said. And somehow, sitting in that cold room with his mother's body right there, Marcus found himself talking. He told the guard about how his mother always made pancakes on Saturdays, how she worked 2 jobs but never missed his school events, how she knew exactly how to make him feel better when he was sad or scared. She sounds like she was a wonderful mother, the guard said when Marcus finally fell quiet. You know what? I bet she's proud of you right now. Marcus looked up in surprise. But I broke in. I did something wrong. Guard Wilson shook his head. You did something brave, something loving. Sure, breaking in wasn't right, but your reason for doing it? That came from love. Sometimes love makes us do crazy things. They sat in silence for a moment. Then the guard asked, Is there someone expecting you at home? Marcus thought about his Aunt Janet, who would be arriving at the apartment soon, if she hadn't already. My aunt. She's supposed to come get me tonight. Take me to Detroit to live with her. The guard nodded slowly. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to call your aunt, tell her where you are. Then I'm going to help you say goodbye to your mama properly. After that, I'll drag you home myself. You're not going to call the police? Marcus asked in disbelief. Guard Wilson smiled sadly. No, son, I think you've learned your lesson about breaking in. But more importantly, I think you need a friend right now more than you need punishment. He helped Marcus close the drawer properly, but not before letting him have a few more minutes to hold his mother's hand and say goodbye. Marcus left the empty vial there with her, tucking it gently into her folded hands. As they walked out of the morgue together, Guard Wilson kept his hand on Marcus's shoulder. It felt strong and warm, almost like how his mother used to guide him through crowds so he wouldn't get lost. You know, the guard said as they reached his car, I work here 5 nights a week. If you ever want to talk about your mama or anything else, you can come by. The right way this time, through the front door. For the first time since his mother died, Marcus felt a tiny spark of hope. Not the desperate kind that had made him break in, but a different kind. The kind that comes from knowing you're not alone. Thank you, Marcus whispered, and he meant it for so many things. 3 months had passed since that night at the morgue. Marcus sat on the steps of his Aunt Janet's house in Detroit, reading his mother's journal. He didn't read it for the ritual anymore. That part was over. Now he read it for the family stories written in its pages, for the pieces of history that connected him to his past. The summer air was warm, so different from that cold night in the morgue. Guard Wilson had driven him home just as he promised, explaining everything to Aunt Janet when they arrived. Instead of being angry, she had hugged Marcus tight and thanked the guard for being so kind. Now, Guard Wilson called every Sunday evening to check on Marcus. They talked about all sorts of things, school, basketball, and especially about Marcus's mother. The guard had even started sharing stories about his own mama, who had passed away 20 years ago. Some people think time heals all wounds. Guard Wilson had told him last Sunday, but that's not quite right. It's what we do with that time that helps us heal. Marcus was starting to understand what he meant. Living with Aunt Janet was different from life with his mother, but not in a bad way. She had her own special things, like making hot chocolate with cinnamon on rainy days, or telling him stories about when his mother was young. The journal in his hands felt different now, too. At first, he had been angry that the ritual hadn't worked. He had even thought about throwing the journal away, but Aunt Janet had stopped him. This isn't just about magic, Marcus, she had said, touching the old leather cover gently. This is our family's story. Your great-grandmother wrote in here. Your grandmother, too. And your mama. They'd all believed in something bigger than themselves. That belief gave them strength. Marcus turned to his favorite page, where his mother had written about the day he was born. Her words were full of joy and love. She had written about how the moment she held him, she knew she would do anything to protect him. Maybe that's the real magic, Guard Wilson had said when Marcus told them about this entry. Not the ritual, but the love that made all these strong women write down their stories for the people they cared about. School in Detroit was different from Chicago, but Marcus was making friends. His best friend here was a boy named David, whose father had died 2 years ago. Sometimes they talked about what it was like to lose a parent. Other times they just played video games and laughed about normal things. Marcus had started writing in the journal too, not about rituals or magic, but about his memories of his mother. He wrote about her pancakes, her singing, her way of making him feel safe. He wrote about the night in the morgue and about Guard Wilson's kindness. He wrote about learning to live with grief, about how it changed but never really went away. Today he was writing about something new. Aunt Janet had helped him start a memory box for his mother. Inside, they put pictures, her favorite scarf, the empty vial from the morgue, and letters Marcus wrote to her sometimes. It sat on his dresser where he could see it every morning. "Your mama's still with you," Aunt Janet often said. "Not in the